Section B. American films since 2005 two-film case study. The two films we'll be studying for this section are No Country for Old Men, the Coen Brothers 2007, and Boyhood, Linklater 2015. So the questions in the exemplar paper are either 2A. How far do your chosen films demonstrate a constant shift between passive and active spectatorship? Refer in detail to at least one sequence from each film. 40 marks. Or B. How far do your chosen films demonstrate the importance of visual and soundtrack cues in influencing spectator response? Refer in detail to at least one sequence from each film. And again, this is worth 40 marks. Here's my answer to 2A. No Country for Old Men generally requires active spectatorship because the audience must pay attention to it due to the twists and turns in the plot, not to mention the crucial visual plot information given throughout the film which would otherwise go unnoticed. If you don't pay attention during No Country for Old Men, you will miss crucial plot points and won't get the film, especially during the sudden bursts of violence which drive the plot. By contrast, Boyhood is harder to define because active spectatorship is required to truly get the most from the film, but not compulsory, since it documents a life from boyhood to manhood, albeit with little in the way of narrative markings to separate different time periods. On the other hand, since the plot is essentially a boy growing up to become a young man, the level of spectatorship is much more meditative and therefore more passive than is required for No Country for Old Men. However, in the case of both films, like most films, active spectatorship yields the most rewards for the audience. The opening to No Country for Old Men lulls the audience into a passive state because it is accompanied by a voiceover. Screenwriting guru Robert McKee teaches that using voiceover to substitute for telling the story via action and dialogue is weak, but that voiceover used to counterpoint and enrich the story can be wonderful. In the case of No Country for Old Men, one can safely argue that it falls into the latter category because the sheriff's voiceover doesn't directly connect with the story but gives an impression of how amoral he has come to believe the world is. This opening section of the opening scene suggests that the audiences are passive because they are listening to the tale the sheriff is imparting. However, the sequence is actually inviting active spectatorship because the memories the sheriff is imparting do not seem to have any bearing on anything at this point, so the spectator has to try and figure out the meaning behind the sheriff's memories. Nonetheless, on reflection upon watching the film entirely and upon repeat reviewings, it becomes clear just why the sheriff despairs so much at what he sees as sheer meaningless nihilism in criminals he has encountered in his career. We are meant to focus on his words because the mise-en-scène and editing only gives us vacant desert landscapes at dawn. So whilst the mise-en-scène seems to offer passive spectatorship, the voiceover actually undercuts this with a seemingly rambling anecdotal monologue that demands more active spectatorship than would first appear. Even though the monologue seems unconnected with the opening scene, or indeed the film, it details the sheriff's bewilderment at the remorselessness of a teenage killer on his way to the electric chair. Quote, said he was going to hell, said he'd be there in 50 minutes. I don't know what to make of that. I surely don't. The end of the voiceover is juxtaposed with the camera cutting to a road, then panning to a police car. A policeman and a man in cuffs enters the frame in mid-shot, so we don't know the identities of either man. This invites active spectatorship as this piques the audience's attention, since we assume the voiceover has bearing on what we are about to see but don't know how yet. So too the enigma codes that the film is presenting, including the gas cylinder that the cop puts in the front seat when he puts the arrested man, Anton, in the car, all invites active spectatorship in order to figure out what's going on. This film is really a case of blink and you'll miss it storytelling because a lot of the detail is visual, not aural, not sound even, with only fleeting visual clues. When the scene cuts to the police station, the scene seems to invite passive spectatorship, since it seems like just a scene where the policeman is on the phone to his superior whilst the convict is in cuffs behind him. This seems just like a typical expository scene wherein a character has a conversation with another only so the screenwriters could give the audience information. This typically invites a passive response from the audience. However, it soon becomes active spectatorship when we notice Anton moving quietly behind him and moving his cuffs from behind him to in front of him. This builds tension and piques the audience's interest since we know the policeman is in danger but he doesn't. When the audience knows something a character doesn't, it is called dramatic irony, and could be argued to be an aspect of active spectatorship, since we pay close attention to Anton even if the policeman doesn't. Tension is raised when Anton throws the cuffs chain around the policeman's throat and throttles him. The active spectatorship continues as the policeman struggles because we don't know if he'll succeed in fending Anton off. It cuts to a bird's eye view and the camera pans into Anton's manic face as he finishes strangling the policeman. So it is clear that the filmmakers are framing Anton as a main character. It can be argued that this invites passive spectatorship, as the filmmakers are signposting Anton's importance instead of keeping the policeman in view and keeping Anton's importance ambiguous. Upon seeing the whole film, the viewer is far more active in their spectatorship on repeat viewing, since they'll know the significance of the gas cylinder, Anton kills people with it, and the meaning behind the opening voiceover. Anton symbolises the new nihilistic breed of criminal that so disturbed the sheriff when he recounts his tale of meeting one on that person's way to the electric chair. All in all, the film does this a lot, with demands on the audience oscillating between needing to be active in order to catch crucial visual plot signifiers, yet at other times allowing passivity, such as when the sheriff recounts his dreams at the end. The opening credits of Boyhood takes place with a blue sky for the background, and automatically the audience seems invited to be passive. This is even more the case than the sedate opening of No Country for Old Men, because there is no anchoring voiceover, just music, and the shot is static, whereas in No Country for Old Men the dawn is breaking and the camera cuts to different areas of the desert, not to mention the voiceover which anchors what we see to meaning. Boyhood then cuts to an extreme close-up of a boy's face looking up to the sky as he lies on the grass. It then cuts to a woman walking out of a school, so the juxtaposition of images makes the spectator more active, since we don't know what the connection is yet. The woman walks over to the boy lying on the grass and they walk off together talking. It is clear they are mother and son, and it cuts to a conversation in the car between them. The conversation is typical and mundane, since the mother is asking why the son isn't turning in homework assignments. But this is the point of the film, since it celebrates all facets of life. Overall, the film invites neither passive nor active spectatorship as such, but more of a meditation on the circle of life. Music is a good prompt in terms of spectatorship, so the smooth, slow tones of Coldplay while the boy looks into the sky indicates an invite to passive spectatorship, whilst the rocking beat of the Hives invites active spectatorship in the next scene as we watch the boy and his friend ride their bikes to an underpass and they spray paint the walls. Both the song and the actions of the characters are rebellious and full of life, so this can't help but grab the audience's attention. Certain members of the audience might also feel actively nostalgic for their rebellious youth and will reflect on that when observing the boys being rebellious, whether it's his mum rebuking him for what he did in class or his antisocial behaviour when he spray paints the wall. However, it's open to debate whether or not a film being evocative for an audience and thus prompting nostalgia not directly related to the film is an example of active spectatorship or passive spectatorship. The film's penultimate scene, where Mason, the boy who is now a young man, is packing for college, is perhaps the most emotional in the entire film, and is therefore one that demands an active spectatorship from the audience. As Mason is obliviously packing his bags and chatting to his mum, the camera focuses on his mum, who is relatively silent. The camera is not focused on him. The camera tracks her as she walks around the apartment with a perplexed facial expression. This piques the interest of the audience, since we don't know why she feels this way, since she should be happy for her son. As she sits down, Mason callously says he's going to leave behind the first ever photo he took, even though his mother packed it for him. The camera cuts back to his mother crying, which elicits emotional sympathy from the audience, because she has been a character whom the audience has invested in as much as her son. For those old enough to have gone through the same bittersweet moment as Mason with their own mothers before going to university, it is likely to provoke a very active and emotional response from them. Likewise, mothers in the audience are likely to actively empathise with Mason's mother when she explains that life has gone past too fast for her, as she watches her son become a man and leave home. In conclusion, most films oscillate between requiring both active and passive spectatorship in order to both keep the audience interested, in the case of active spectatorship, but also allow them to enjoy the escapism that films allow, in the case of passive spectatorship. It could be argued that all spectatorship is active, as the spectator is a co-creator of meaning and the person who produces response, both intellectual and emotional. No Country for Old Men encourages the audience to be engaged and active in interpreting the narrative. The absence of non-diegetic soundtrack makes us far more sensitive to the sound design of each scene and upsets our expectations. The Coen brothers said they wanted to remove the safety net of incidental music that tells us when to feel scared, relieved, etc. Without a score to guide our emotion, the spectator becomes much more attuned to the subtleties of the cinematography and performances in order to interpret the action. Even in narrative terms, the film is full of ellipses that require the spectator to fill in the gaps. The most notable being the death of Moss, which would have traditionally been the climax of the story. The use of ellipses is also referenced by Wells when he says, "In the elevator I counted the floors. There's one missing." By contrast, from the very start of Boyhood, the spectator is directly aligned with Mason Jr. and it is his point of view that we follow throughout the narrative. His character's journey is given the most prominence, despite the clear changes in other protagonist development, namely Olivia. Certainly the scene when Mason Jr. is about to leave home to go to college might be read very differently by a young person in that position and also by a parent. The spectator response here is likely to show a great deal of diversity, and that got the full 40 marks.